Hey everyone, today we're doing a really interesting species spotlight, and we're going to highlight a very common, but not a very commonly kept, or at least very popular pet amphibian, and that is the green tree frog. This is their new setup that I just made up because for a while I kept them quite a bit differently, but this is just kind of for an ease of things, and I'll get to the reason why that is later in the video. But let's talk about one of North America's coolest tree frogs. Now, the green tree frog is a really cool species of North American tree frog that is endemic to the southeastern part of the United States. And like its namesake, it is a green tree frog. However, a lot of that stuff is actually a little bit misleading and not wholly correct. Now, while it is true they are an arboreal species of true frog that does live in the United States, its range is not exclusively only to the southeastern part of the country, as well as they're not always entirely green. As far as their range goes, they can actually be found all along the coast from Florida, even as far north as all the way up to even Delaware and New Jersey, and as far west as central Texas. So really still staying in very warm, humid, almost subtropical areas, but pretty extensive as far as range goes. And then that green thing that we just mentioned before. While they are called the green tree frog, and you can see the female that is right here, there's actually 3 of them in this cage. They are usually green. That is the most common color. However, they can sometimes be a ruddy reddish brown and even tones of different gray and even very slightly a little bit of kind of mottled color. However, there are a few things that are usually pretty consistent, one of which is their underbelly. They all have a light creamy to white underbelly, and almost all of them have that really nicely defined line that can either be a yellow to a light brown to almost a pure white color. Now these guys are moderate size as far as North American tree frogs go, although a pretty small frog in general, typically an inch and a half to about 2 inches long. Females, as I pointed out earlier, are considerably larger than the males. However, with the case of a lot of different frogs and toads, and amphibians in general, it's the boys that are the ones that you'll always hear. The male tree frog is pretty well known for their really cool mating call. These calls are made during the evenings and into the night, and that is to attract a mate. And it is really cool to listen to most species of frogs and toads listening to that mating call. It's really cool. However, just because the males are always calling for the females, that usually means the females are coming to the boys when they're doing these calls. However, some males try to play a pretty tricky game. Instead of making their own competing calls, some males will actually listen to others' calls and try to either imitate it or even stay quiet and try to intercept or kind of get to that female first and mate with that female before the male who's actually doing a lot of the calling to go into that. Now these guys are true amphibians and frogs as previously mentioned. So what that means is that these guys, like many amphibians, most frogs and toads, and most amphibians in general, I'm just going to keep saying amphibian, are born from eggs usually laid in water, and the green tree frog is no exception. And then they hatch out as tadpoles, and then they go through, over a course of time, usually several weeks, through a process called metamorphosis, and they will eventually turn from the little legless, just head and tail tadpole into the full-grown frog, and then slowly grow to their adult size. And then they leave the water and continue the cycle. Now, as far as pets go, obviously this isn't a really cuddly pet reptile. In the wild and in captivity, they're very timid, even for frogs, and pretty much all frogs are fairly timid. And so in the wild, a lot of times, if you manage to sneak up on some, usually they're very quick to make a quick dash into the water. And then in captivity as a pet, they're really quick to make that dash, probably under your couch. So not really one that you really want to take out. Not to mention the fact that obviously being an amphibian, they have very loose, they have very thin, they have very porous skin, which makes it dangerous to handle them with your bare hands. I just moved these guys into this enclosure, and I did it with gloves on very quickly as to try to limit the amount of stress that these guys are in. Now, as I previously mentioned, this is their new setup. The reason why I actually got these guys is for a couple different reasons. Number one, I really like the mating calls that pretty much every species of frog likes to make. And the second one actually has to do with being a feeder. While I wasn't necessarily going to be feeding off any of these frogs, my plan was actually to possibly either having them spawn or using them to scent pinkies for my Asian rat snakes, specifically my goniosoma, and even more specifically the baby rhino rat snakes. However, all of them did successfully transfer from fish to pinky mice. So hooray on that front. So these guys were actually kept over just water with a bunch of elevated stuff for them to climb and hide into. However, the upkeep of that, even with the filter, is kind of a pain in the butt. And because I'm not doing a whole lot of breeding, I can still try to use them to scent. So that's why I changed this up. These guys are definitely a more of a display species, and so it's really fun to actually kind of build up these little enclosures and to really have a good time in the evenings listening to these guys. They're not an incredibly long-lived species, typically in that 5 to 7 year-ish range, so kind of a short and sweet, but they're still really fun. They're really cute to watch and to move around and definitely to listen to. Always remember, you don't want to keep them too hot because these guys are nocturnal, crepuscular to a degree, so they're coming out in the cooler evenings, so you don't want their temps super hot, and also you want to make sure you keep that humidity up because these are coming from an area that, while yes, not South America, Brazil rainforest, they are coming from portions of the United States that have incredibly high ambient humidity and lots of water in the air. And so because being amphibians, they absorb that water through their skin. That is very important for them. But I just wanted to talk about this really cool species of tree frog that, while very common and commonly kept, despite, like most amphibians these days, having a fair bit of population decline due to fungal infections and human encroachment and polluted water and all those things, they're still doing pretty okay, and they've been in the hobby for a very long time, but no one ever really talks about them. These guys are really cool, very small display species that, because they stay small, you don't have to keep them in very large habitats. Just make sure you give them a little bit of height like this enclosure, and they're pretty ready, easily to keep. Always making sure to give them a nice varied diet of bugs with sprinkled in calcium and vitamin D3. If you want to give them really kind of low light, like the LED Sure Sun early call or first call LED UVA UVB bulbs, those work really well. I use them on some of my other species of frogs, and I'm getting more this year to be putting on top of these guys too. So if you guys really like this video, please like and subscribe, hit the bell notification if you can. Check out my full playlist of these species spotlights. There's now 70 different species that we talk about. And again, if you want to hear me talk about anything else, any other species, questions, comments, concerns, let me know down in the comments below. Again, thank you all so much. Hope everyone's having a great day, and we'll check you next time.